Infamous Lady in Red Coffin has tourists flocking from all over to view the morbid site. Normally, the thought of visiting a coffin of some random person you've never met would sound like a morbid activity, best left for some curiously macabre minds. However, there's actually one gravesite in Mississippi that sees droves of tourists every year. All they want is a peek at the dead woman's face. Oddfellows Cemetery, like most cemeteries in the country, was visited primarily by families who had deceased members residing on the grounds. However, when people found out the Lady in Red was relocated there, fascinated tourists poured in to take part in the mysterious phenomenon. "I remember when they found her and people were talking about it," said Chris Hammett, a resident of Lexington, Mississippi. "It was the talk of the town. It's just a mystery, who she is and where she came from. That's because her original resting place wasn't Oddfellows." The Yazoo River flows through both Louisiana and Mississippi, and many consider it to mark the southern boundary of the Mississippi Delta. While the river is known for its intense water flow and scenic paddleboat rides, one construction crew discovered something that it certainly wasn't known for. In 1969, a crew of workmen were making their way down the bank of the Yazoo River with a massive backhoe. Their goal was to dig up a new septic tank line for residents who lived in the area. Everything was going according to plan when suddenly the backhoe struck something unexpected. Once the crew cleared the backhoe out of the area, they could see what its rock bucket hit while digging. It was a coffin. Everyone looked at each other puzzled. This wasn't anywhere close to a cemetery, and the actual coffin itself was unlike anything the men had seen before either. It was called a fish iron casket, which was specially designed to keep bodies preserved for long periods of time to prevent decomposition. Popular in the mid-1800s, these products were superior to wooden coffins because the corpses could travel long distances without erosion, and they also had a nifty little window in case of disease. No one would dare open up a casket if they knew the body inside was potentially riddled with an airborne illness, so there was a glass window by the head that allowed for friends and family to view the body safely. But there was one other detail about this particular coffin that truly allowed for the impeccable condition of the woman's body. The body was completely preserved in alcohol. According to some of the people who found her in 1969, even though she had been dead for decades, she looked exactly as though she could have died the day before. She also had some very striking standout features. Writer Jane Biggers spoke of the discovery just days after it happened. The unidentified woman was discovered a few days ago in a metal, glass-lined casket in a garden plot on Egypt Plantation and near the home occupied by the J.T. Thomas family. It seemed like everyone who saw the body couldn't help but stare in amazement. "Something has been pulling me to her," Chris Hammett continued. "She was someone's child, sister, someone's pain and grief. She has no one to speak for her. She has no one to pray over her. She has no one to put flowers on her grave. I don't want her to ever be forgotten again. The woman was just so alluring. For one, she had long jet black hair, a red velvet dress, a cape, and buckled shoes. She was dressed quite well for someone about to find themselves 6 feet underground. And according to one cemetery worker named Walter Pitchford, she was quite the looker. She was real pretty," he said. "Her hair was black-looking and long. She was a young lady." Biggers continued, "Persons viewing the woman, who has been described as in her 20s or 30s, dressed in red velvet with long brown hair, estimate that she has been dead at least 75 years. Although no one knew who she was, historians have found clues that narrow things down a bit. Using clues based on the clothing and fish iron casket, it's likely she died prior to the Civil War. This fact alone means the preservation job from both the alcohol and specialized coffin was even more impressive. Not long after the Lady in Red was found, she was reburied in a cemetery in Starkville, Mississippi. One plausible theory is that the fish iron casket was one of several being transported along the bank of the river, and perhaps rocky terrain caused it to slip off without the driver knowing. There are also people who believe it may have been an actual accident on the river that claimed her life. Paddleboat tours up and down the Yazoo River were especially popular decades ago, and she could very well have been a passenger who fell overboard and drowned. This, of course, didn't explain the coffin or the pristine condition of her body, so even though theories existed, no one could pinpoint anything exact. People came from all over, cemetery worker Pitchford said. They wanted to know where the lady in red was, and I'd stop mowing and show them the lady in red. Finally, it all died off and they stopped coming. But then the cemetery was handed over to another groundskeeper. In 2018, the groundskeeping responsibilities of the cemetery were handed off to the Lexington Oddfellows Endowment, and a woman named Cam Bonelli is now actively trying to dig up more information on the elusive Victoria-era Lady in Red. It's a mystery too juicy to ever completely forget about. Will anyone ever discover the true identity of the infamous Lady in Red? It's hard to say, but the fact that she spent so many years underground without so much as a blemish on her skin is more than remarkable. She's just one of the mysteries that make cemeteries so fascinating. Buying a grave plot has to be one of the top items on the list of things most people don't like to think about. As it turns out, however, we should all be paying more attention. Recent reports have exposed the grave reality behind the funeral industry, and it's not looking good for any of us. Ultimately, a cemetery is a business just like any other. It needs to attract customers, offset costs, and keep up with the changing times. But as of late, graveyards are running into a seriously morbid issue that's causing them to hemorrhage funds at an alarming rate. Just ask Mike Ciamaga. The New Yorker started a summer job at Brooklyn's Washington Cemetery decades ago and rose to the position of manager. Now that he's at the top, his organization is running into an unexpected and potentially fatal issue. Be warned, as it is not for the faint of heart. They've nearly run out of available grave plots. The main revenue driver for any burial ground, Washington has already pushed its boundaries to the limit by squeezing in additional memorials under train tracks and around its offices. Though its recent plot prices surpassed $16,000, that high price tag can only keep Mike and his colleagues afloat for so long. Locals continually approach him looking to buy, but Washington simply doesn't have the supply to keep up with the demand. For long-established burial sites like Washington Cemetery, the only answer is to increase density. Rather than sell individual sections of land, they can increase capacity by utilizing more mausoleums. For a more cost-effective measure, burial grounds can also save space through cremations. Of course, this option is completely dependent on the preference of the deceased. On occasion, graveyards relocate entirely to keep business afloat. They may switch to a larger location, especially if they occupy prime real estate that land developers want to purchase. Nevertheless, many of them are still digging their own financial graves. According to Forest Lawn Memorial Park Association Chairman John Llewellyn, most cemeteries aren't planning ahead for the future. While they're mandated to put much of their revenue in a long-term savings account, this alone won't keep them alive. Graveyards are indebted to provide a place for the deceased forever. Unfortunately, the costs of upkeep also go on for eternity. These businesses have to pay for landscaping and cover taxes, regardless of how many burials happen that month. For some establishments, it's all just too much. The management packs up and leaves the grounds and markers to crumble. Perhaps another party will come in to fix things up, but in many cases, no such rescue ever arrives. By and large, the forecast for traditional graveyards doesn't look good, though that doesn't mean that some locations aren't adapting. Take, for example, this family picnicking between tombs. If you can believe it, the cemetery is encouraging it. This is the new strategy of the Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. They're aiming to bring burial grounds back to the living by setting aside special time slots for group events, runner happy hours, and yoga classes. The outlook is not an entirely original one. It harkens back to the Victorian era, when architects meant for burying sites to double as public green spaces. Masterpieces like the Mount Auburn Cemetery outside Boston featured the most advanced landscaping ever seen. Laurel Hill took that same approach and updated it for the 21st century. On warm summer evenings, they've taken to hosting movie nights. Other cemeteries, meanwhile, have transformed themselves into literal art spaces. Atlanta's Oakland Cemetery dates back to before the Civil War. Georgians recently came up with a unique way of celebrating its history with the annual Illumine exhibition. Over several nights, an array of lights and displays detail the stories of the inhabitants. This event makes Oakland a more interactive site, morphing it into a place of remembrance and beauty. It also doesn't hurt that Illumine has a cash bar inside the cemetery grounds. A more active programming slate could very well be the salvation for memorial parks everywhere. Nevertheless, they still need to set aside hours for their primary purpose: interring bodies. You don't want to interrupt a funeral with a cocktail party after all.